Hi everyone, I am Rachelle Dene Poth, and I'm excited to be part of Learning Revolution's Emergency Home Learning and More Summit. And I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas with you today. Hopefully that you can get some ideas that you can put into practice in your classroom, whether you are in virtual learning, if you're in your physical classroom space, or hybrid. So today I'll be talking to you about learning anywhere, finding the right tools to empower students. And as I said, my name is Rachelle Dene Poth. I would love to connect with you on Twitter, also on Instagram. It's rdene915. Also, I have a blog site, rdene915.com, and I do have a podcast where I share some different ideas. And so I would invite you to connect with me and let me know how it's going for you, what tools you're using, if you try some of the ones that I'll share with you today. A little bit about me. I am a Spanish and STEAM teacher. I'm also a consultant and an attorney. So I love learning. I love getting involved in all things related to education. I currently, in this year, am now the past president of ISTE's Teacher Education Network. I recently became ISTE certified this past summer, at the end of July, actually, so I really enjoyed that process. I'm an ambassador for several different ed tech companies, and it helps me to be connected with other educators to find out how they're using some different tools, also to build my PLN, and to hear about different experiences, especially now as we're seeing so many changes happen with school and with education. And as mentioned, I'm also an author and blogger, and I've written a few books in the last 2 years where I share a lot of ideas, a lot of stories, actually some from my students and some from other educators as well. So my whole motivation is to be able to share some ideas with other educators to save some time, to give you some actionable steps that you can feel comfortable just getting started with right away. And so that's what I'm excited to share with you here today. First thing that I guess I should tell you is I've gotten a lot of things wrong in the past. As a teacher, I'm constantly learning new things, especially for my students. And a few years ago, I was really struggling with engagement. And the biggest problem was that I didn't really know what it meant. And so I found this meme online at some point in a Twitter chat or something one time. And it just stuck with me because I was using the word engagement, student engagement, and I really thought that I understood what it meant. And I couldn't understand why my students weren't doing as well as I thought that they should be, because in my mind, I thought that they were really engaged in the class and the lessons and the activities that I was having them do. So I reached out to my PLN. I was asking questions to my students. I was doing some readings, did some research, and found out that I totally had it completely wrong. I was looking at students and thinking because they were playing a game, for example, that they were engaged in the lesson, or because they did a certain activity, that was student engagement. But again, I had it all wrong. So once I started to focus on really understanding student engagement and what I could do as a teacher to improve student engagement and really make it a more authentic and meaningful experience for my students, I noticed a lot of positive benefits, not just for them, but for me as well. So it started with me kind of breaking the things that I was originally doing, getting away from my habits. Not that my habits in all cases were bad to have as a teacher, but what I noticed is that I had been teaching the same way that I had been taught, and I was afraid to try some different ideas. I was doing things that worked well for me as a student. And like I said, I'm a Spanish and a STEAM teacher. In high school, I took French. And so when I started teaching, and every year from that point, I kept doing a lot of the same activities. I had my students lined up in rows. I was using the workbook pages, assigning homework every night, not really opening it up for a lot of student choice in how they did projects or activities that they chose to do. So once I got rid of the rows of desks, this is a few years ago, and I opened myself up to more of the student ideas that were coming in, for acknowledging that I tried something and it didn't go so well or didn't go like I thought that it would, and also being comfortable when students would turn in a project or an assignment and it wasn't the exact way that I wanted it to be done. Once I kind of got away from that a little bit, I started to notice that students were really interested more in the class. There were less times where they were looking at the clock, wondering when the class period was over. I got to know more about them and build relationships, and they got to know more about each other. And it didn't take too much time until I could feel the classroom kind of environment was changing, and the students would come in and they would say they felt like they were part of a learning community, a learning family. And so that made a big difference for me. So it kept me kind of moving forward, always looking for new ideas. The biggest thing that I try to focus on, aside from why am I going to try this different method or this digital tool, is how can we empower students? When I'm considering making some changes in my classroom, especially in the last 6, 7, 8 months now of our year here, going back to the previous school year and with the start of this school year, what are opportunities that I can create when we don't necessarily know what it's going to be, if we're going to be in our classrooms, or if we're going to need to transition to virtual learning or hybrid learning throughout the year. So I always focus on some goals, and my goals, once I figured out student engagement, were to make sure that I was giving students an opportunity to learn about things happening in the world. How could I create more authentic and meaningful experiences for them? Because as I learned, as we know, when students have more choice in what they're doing, it leads to an increase in motivation. They become more engaged as a result. And so you start to see this progression like I did, where students were afraid to respond in class. They were afraid to be wrong. And I said, it's okay to make mistakes. That's how we learn. I make a ton of mistakes every single day. And once students see us doing that, taking some risks, trying some different things, asking for their input, then it empowers them to take the lead on their own. They become the leaders in the classroom. They become more confident learners. They're more comfortable. And so these are just some of the things I try to keep in mind all the time. Like I said, my goal. So I'll be sharing with you some of the ways that I've done some different things in my classroom, and hopefully we'll give you some ideas, or maybe there are things that you're already doing and forgot about. Like for me, I had forgot about Hyperdocs, for example. This is something that will work well regardless of where learning is happening. And the first time that I found out about Hyperdocs a couple of years ago, I really didn't know what I was doing entirely, but I got the book. I started to follow the hashtag on Twitter. I got onto the website for the Hyperdocs from the authors of the book and found just one of the example templates that was there, and thought about some of the activities that I have my students do. And I put some things together following that structure, but adding in the activities for Spanish levels 2 and 3 at the time. When I did it, it was because I needed to be out of my classroom for a few days, and I didn't want to just give my students some different papers or some activities in the book. I wanted them to have some independence to work at their own pace, and this ended up being a really great start for that. Granted, there were some glitches along the way, as to be expected, I guess, but it was a really good learning experience for me, and my students really enjoyed having that chance where they could go through and they had choices. They could complete the activities, they could work at their own pace, they had opportunities to extend their learning in different ways. So I highly recommend checking out Hyperdocs if it's not something that you had done. The website has so many, and that's one of the nice things about digital tools, about different types of methods we might use. There are so many resources available that time is always a factor. We often worry about the learning curve with some of the different tools that are out there, and it's nice to know that we don't have to start from scratch. We can, it's an option, but it's also good to know that if we don't have a lot of time and we're looking for new ideas, that we can go to a site, we can follow people on Twitter, we can get into a Twitter chat, use the hashtag, for example, like Hyperdocs, and have some ideas that we can get started with right away in our classroom. Like I said, I started in the physical classroom space, and students would submit their work. I could see how they were making their progress in the class, but it also worked very well in the spring when schools closed to give students the chance to do something at their own pace on their own schedule when we couldn't meet in the same space or at the same time. I also recommend, besides the authors of the Hyperdocs Handbook, checking out the tweets and also the website from Steve Wick on Twitter. He puts so many different websites, digital tools, blogs, resources, you name it, available on his site. You'll definitely find some Hyperdocs there, but also going to the Hyperdocs website, checking out the video. One thing that I also recommend is I always want my students to understand why I'm choosing a certain digital tool, for example, or a different method, or why I chose an activity. And showing them the video on Hyperdocs is something that I had done. This one is available. And if you just get started with it and say, okay, this is what a Hyperdoc is, this is how we can use it, but always ask for their feedback, because that's important too, to find out, what a difference it makes for them. What did they like about it? What did they not necessarily like about it? And then, just like our students, we are always learning as we go. So we need that feedback too. Another idea is choice boards. And when I first did this, I hand wrote it on a piece of notebook paper. I made copies. I handed it to my students, and I explained it a little bit to them. But at first, they were kind of confused about what I had handed them. They thought it was actually tic-tac-toe. I explained what the web's depth of knowledge was and why the different activities that were in there were so different. Some of them just had them drawing a picture or writing a story. Some of them were asking them to create something like a presentation using some tools you may use yourself, like Nearpod or Muncie, or they had to create a Flipgrid video. But the idea is we give them choices of how to practice what it is that they're learning. And for me, as a Spanish teacher, I like having students do some of the same activities, because I want to make sure that they build their skills and that I can kind of evaluate across the board to see what all students are doing. But I also want to give them choices that they're comfortable with. So when students decide, I think I'm going to create a word scramble, or I'm going to draw a picture and write a description about it in Spanish, and maybe some of them decide they want to make a game like a Kahoot or a Quizzes, or make a set of flashcards on Quizlet. Those things that the students create give them more authentic and meaningful practice, but it also creates something else that we can use with the other students in that class, and things that we can keep moving forward. So they're creating something that's very purposeful, not just for them, but it's also a great way to help them to create resources and materials for others. So again, in a hybrid, virtual, whatever type of learning environment you might be in, like Hyperdocs, choice boards is another great choice, no pun intended, that you can use for your learning. And I think it's really important when we consider digital tools and methods that we're using to think about the transitions that we might have to make. And that's one thing that I try to be consistent with when I'm sharing ideas is, if it's a tool, can you use that in the classroom and virtually? Will students have access to it? Because like in the spring, we may find out that our schools are closing for a couple of days or longer. And so we need to have methods and tools and things in place for our students and the families that are supporting them, so that if we do have to make those transitions, it's not such a big change like it was in the spring. So in addition to Hyperdocs and choice boards, Genius Hour is something else that I really enjoy having my students do. I did this with my 8th graders this past year, and the idea behind it, if you're looking for a book to read, I recommend Pure Genius by Don Wettrick. Do the hashtag Genius Hour. John Spencer creates some great videos on a lot of different topics, like this one that you can find on YouTube on what is Genius Hour. And like I mentioned with Hyperdocs, I also showed my students the video on Genius Hour. I explained to them what it is, but I also wanted somebody else to talk about it, because for me as the teacher to say, this is what we're doing and this is what it's about and these are the benefits is one thing, but I also like for them to hear from others, other educators, other students, to get that perspective beyond just my own. Essentially, Genius Hour gives students a chance to explore an idea that they're interested in, to share their genius, as we may or you may have heard it referred to. It goes back to like 20% time, where 80% of the time you're working on your typical activities in class, you're covering the content, you're creating the lessons, and students are engaging with you. The 20% time, if you devote that amount of time to it, gives students a chance to explore something on their own. And so when schools were closed in the spring, not all of my students could join in our classes, and it was really hard to keep everything kind of consistent like I would have done had we been in our physical classroom space. So having this in place where I could give them a chance to explore something on their own, like Genius Hour, made a difference for them and for me. Similar to Genius Hour, something else that I have really enjoyed over the last probably 5 years, something else that I was definitely wrong about, is project-based learning. For years, I thought I was doing PBL, but I realized I was not. I was doing learning, having my students do learning based on projects instead. And it took reading a couple of books, attending a few conferences a couple of summers ago. Actually, the book Launch by AJ Giuliani and John Spencer, I read, and there was a quote in there that stuck with me about assigning projects. And if you get 30 back of the same thing, it's not a project, it's a recipe. And I didn't totally quote that in the exact words, but that's the essence of what it was. And so I invested time in exploring and learning about what is project-based learning. How can I provide opportunities for my students with PBL? What are the benefits? And when I started, like I said, I read the book Launch. I had attended some presentations, one of which was by Don Wettrick at a conference in Wisconsin. Also at ISTE in the summer, I went to some sessions. I read Susie Boss's book on project-based learning, also Hacking Project-Based Learning by Ross Cooper and Aaron Murphy. And so great books, great resources to check out. Buck Institute of Education now has the PBL Works, where you can find, again, rubrics and templates. You can find links to videos, lots of videos out there. John Spencer also has another video. Again, I shared it with my students. But the best part about this is that students, if you choose to do it the way that I did, students chose their own topics. And in the first year, of course, there were a lot of things that we had to learn. I had to learn a lot because, like I said, I didn't know exactly what PBL was. And so I invested the time in learning about it. I found out what the essential elements are for authentic PBL. I spent a couple of days talking to my students about it. We decided, actually they decided, that Fridays would be the day for them to explore on their own, because I really wanted them to invest their own time in it, to be independent in learning, to choose their topics. Now, you can decide to have a theme for your project-based learning and work on it as a class. It can be individually. You can have students work together in pairs or in a small group. It's up to you. I started by having students work on their own. And then throughout the year, we kind of changed it based on what I was thinking and noticing and what my students thought about the whole process. When we started, they chose their topics. We connected with other students in Argentina and students in Spain using Edmodo. And I had set it up with a few teachers to have conversation. And I wanted my students to learn about other Spanish-speaking countries, but to be able to actually ask students or other teachers who were from those places, whatever the questions were that they had. What's it like to grow up in Argentina? What are schools like in Spain? What are family customs or traditions? And go beyond just doing a project and being done with it, but to really invest and be curious about learning. And so for my students, the first time, for some of them, it was a challenge because they were used to being told exactly what to research, what to put together for the end product, and then moving on. But for some of my students, initially, after they did their first kind of presentation, they were a little bit disappointed because they weren't excited about what they had learned, and they could see their classmates presenting. And I noticed it as well, because when students would share what their PBL was about, they didn't read from their presentation if they had one. They sounded excited, they looked excited, and they were really enthusiastic about what they had learned. And you could just tell, like you could feel that they had actually done PBL. And I asked them, do you feel like you did a project, or do you feel like you were involved in project-based learning? I asked students to give each other feedback, which of course can be uncomfortable, but that is important. It's important for us to give students feedback, for students to give each other feedback, and of course for them to give us feedback as well. So we started with Edmodo. Other tools out there that I'll share with you here shortly: Flipgrid for seeing and hearing each other. We used Edmodo initially just to have the conversations, and then my students were so excited when they actually got to see the people who they were having conversations with and they were asking questions with for their project-based learning. We used Padlet to post their projects and their PBL, whatever it was that they created on, but we also use that for conversation. And so lots of things out there that we can use. The idea is to give our students a chance to connect with each other, to connect beyond our learning space with others, especially with project-based learning. So now I'd like to tell you about some different tools that I used for Genius Hour or project-based learning, or things that I added into choice boards or Hyperdocs, for example. One of them is Muncie, and it is my favorite. I'm often asked to name a tool that I think teachers should try if they're looking for something different. And I always recommend Muncie because you can do so much with it, and because of all of the other possibilities that integrate with Muncie that you can add on to. So if you look on the screen, you can probably see some other tools that you're using, maybe Kahoot or Nearpod or Wonderopolis, for example, YouTube videos, Flipgrid as well. If you're using Flipgrid, Muncie and Flipgrid have an integration now. So a lot of things that I'd like to do with my students in terms of activities is giving them the chance where there's multiple different digital tools involved, so they have choice, that they also build skills they need as far as technology, that they're comfortable in creating something, speaking in Spanish, interacting with their classmates, and especially now when we couldn't be in the same physical space, getting to know our students. So creating a welcoming space, whether it's at the start of the year or throughout the year, right? Getting to know our students, giving them an opportunity to get to know each other. Very important for us also to let the families know who we are. So using Muncie, we can create an About Me. We can have students create their own About Me where they record a video, where they talk and introduce themselves. If it's a project they're doing or a presentation, lots of other options that they can add into it. They can include a YouTube video. They can put a link to another website. They can just record audio. But the best thing about it is that there are thousands of templates available, more than 35,000 different objects available in their media library. So what I found is that even students who don't necessarily want to use technology, or even teachers sometimes that don't necessarily want to use technology, I find that there's something in Muncie for everyone, and they can get started right away, whether starting from scratch or using one of the many templates available. So here's some ideas that may be based on what you teach, or if you're looking for some new ideas, like I mentioned, create an About Me. Recently, I had my students participate in Global Maker Day, and we were talking about being an entrepreneur. So they created a digital business card, they made a flyer for a business, book recommendations or book reviews, movies, anything that you're studying, depending on what grade level you teach, content area, fun things you can do, icebreakers. You can find so much, or even just doing a check-in. If you're not in your classroom, recording a short video to share with your students or with the family so that they can see you and hear you and build those relationships even if we're not in that same space. As I mentioned already, Flipgrid, and Flipgrid was another tool that we use for project-based learning. Getting to see the students in Argentina, what their school looks like, hear their accents, see how they're dressed, see everything in the background, and to be able to have conversations. The same with students in Spain, but also to have students speak up about what they're learning in class. In the physical classroom space, over the years we've all noticed that sometimes students don't want to answer. They're afraid of being wrong. And I really try to emphasize that it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to not know the answer, that's part of learning. And for my students, I want them to build their speaking skills in Spanish, and they don't necessarily want to do that by standing up and speaking in front of their classmates. And of course, now if we're not in our classroom, we're not in front of our classmates anyway, we're learning virtually. So having something like Flipgrid where students can be comfortable and record a video, if it's a Spanish speaking assignment, if it's for project-based learning, if it's for you to just check in with students and ask a question. But there are a lot of different topics that are already available for discussion in Flipgrid. And this, again, is a tool that you can use at any time. So if you're in your physical classroom space, students can have the app. If you're in hybrid learning, you can set it up, and so students can see each other, they can hear each other. You can set it up so they can respond to each other. Lots of possibilities. I could do a whole session on Flipgrid and on Muncie, each tool individually, but definitely tools that have a lot of different possibilities for using them in any type of learning environment. The next one I'd like to tell you about is Synth. This is essentially a podcasting tool. I have used it for the last couple of years for many things, project-based learning. It has been an option with choice boards or Hyperdocs, for example. I used it for one of the books that I wrote. I had some of the people who contributed stories read what they had written so that the reader reading the book could actually hear the tone of the person telling their story. Using it for speaking assessments. Students were more comfortable recording it, and if they wanted to record it again, they could. Project-based learning, asking questions. My students would ask, What's the food like in schools, or what are your sports teams like, and finding out that not all schools have sports teams, and being able to see each other if they wanted to have the video on, or at the very least hear each other. Now this year, what I have found is that because I want students, at the beginning of the year in Spanish 1, we do the alphabet, and typically I'm spelling words in class, repeating them for my students, but the audio quality whenever you're in a meeting, regardless of what the platform is, sometimes it doesn't come through as clear. And I want students to be able to hear me when I'm spelling it. So I use Synth to record some words that I was spelling with practicing the alphabet, or if it was a conversation, or in class, if we would typically do some listening comprehension activities with a CD or something else that I had on my computer. We're not there. So I would just record them and have it available. Students can listen to it, pause it, go back and listen. You can also set it up so students could respond to your prompt and create a thread. It's a free tool to use. I definitely recommend checking it out. Easy to get started. The limit is 256 seconds, but it's just enough that, again, to have a conversation if you want students to talk about what they're learning and have a different option. Speaking of talking about what they're learning and having lots of options, Padlet is another one of our favorite tools because of all of the ways that you can use it. I have probably been using Padlet for about 7 years, I think. When I started using it, it was just as a way to store student projects, like some of the examples that you see on the screen, and then it evolved over the years. And my students would often say, you have like hundreds of Padlets within one Padlet. And that's the beauty of it, is that you can keep student projects, or students can create a digital portfolio. It can be used as a discussion board, so a back channel chat, for example. I had students use it for their project-based learning. They posted their information. I had students even record their own videos as they were working on their PBL to just remember what their thoughts were. But it's a great space to either have an asynchronous conversation, or even in my class today, I actually had students create kind of like a fashion show. We're learning about clothing and shopping and buying gifts. So I asked students, some of which are in the class because we're hybrid and some are at home, to find somebody wearing, a shirt, pants, some accessories, or anything. I wanted them to find like 5 or 6 clothing or accessory items, and then name what they were and include an adjective, whether it was a color or the type of fabric or something to describe it, and post it on a Padlet. So all students could see, and then we could go over and check the grammar. Did the adjectives agree, for example? So lots of ways that you can use this regardless of what the content area is that you're teaching, but there are a lot of options for audio, for video that you can use. Okay, Book Creator is one that was newer to me in the last probably 1.5 years or so. I had created some, just trying it out on my own, but a couple of months ago, a woman that I know, Christina, an educator actually, had a lot of educators put together this amazing book with Book Creator, and it's all about apps and tools. So the idea behind it is students can collaborate and create a book together. Doesn't matter what the age of the students are, you can add in a lot of different backgrounds, you can put in your Bitmoji, you can have tons of links. It is easy to get started with, and then you can publish the books, of course, so open and read the book. And for students, being able to collaborate, even if they're not in that same space, is a big deal. And so as a teacher, you can create a library for students. So if students, like my class, we used another tool, Storybird, online, and they created stories about their childhood or their family, and all, of course, written in Spanish. And you can have them online, but you can also have them downloaded as a PDF, or you can buy them in a soft or hardcover book, which is what I did, and I put them in my classroom. So very authentic and meaningful way for students to write their own stories. And now I have those books that I can use every year when I am introducing that same vocabulary to my students. So teachers can create libraries of books with Book Creator. It does have standards available. So again, if you're looking for something that supports the standards in these areas, looking at social emotional learning, which is something else across the board with project-based learning, for example, or with Other tools like Muncie or Flipgrid, helping students to build those social emotional learning skills and digital citizenship skills as well, especially now since so much of what we are doing is online. We really do have to have things in place for our students that can help them to develop these skills, to learn to collaborate and communicate in that same virtual space. And by having some of these tools, gives them an opportunity. And it's great for us. We don't have to, even though for years I thought I had to be the expert on everything, we don't have to be the expert. We just need to know enough about the tool, what the purpose is, make sure that everything is okay in terms of access for our students, the security and the privacy, all of that, but give students the chance to work together, especially if they're not in that same space. And then when they put this book together with Book Creator, for example, and share that, not just with your class and the students in your classroom, but you can share and collaborate with other classrooms. So we're looking at global collaboration and, again, building those social emotional learning skills, helping students to become socially aware. It definitely makes a difference for students and, of course, for us as educators as well. And so in closing, what I would like to share with you a couple of ideas, and I'll stop sharing here in a moment, because I just wanted to give a few last minute kind of things for you to check out. Definitely recommend Muncie, and I am going to pull my screen up again to give you an idea about Muncie, because I think it's really important to see what some examples are, because for us as teachers, sometimes we don't necessarily know what every tool does. We might be using it for one purpose and think, wow, I never thought about using it for this other idea or something, and often the ideas come from our students. And so one of them, like I said, that is my favorite is Muncie, because you can do so much with it. And you can create Muncie boards. There are templates available. So if you were to create on your own, you always want students to create with version 3.0 because that's the newest. It is available on iOS for the app. They recently added on augmented reality. So if your students have an iPad or the iPhone, but what I like about it is that, again, with all of these tools that I mentioned and the many more out there that I didn't get a chance to mention, and I would love to hear from you as well, what are you using? Or what is something that you've been thinking about trying and maybe you're not sure what might be the best tool or what might be the best method? Not that I'm an expert, but I do enjoy sharing what I've been working on. Happy to share what challenges I've encountered as well and help you find some ideas to get started with quickly, especially now since time is just, there's never enough time. And we want some ideas that we can put into place and give our students opportunities to create and be more engaged in learning. And so when it comes to tools like Muncie, being able to scroll through, they're always adding new ideas. So if you're looking for something and you don't even know what you're looking for, sometimes I think, I really wish I could do something different. I just don't know what that is. Go to Muncie and see what their new ideas are. Hour of Code is coming up, so you'll find lots. And look, Hour of Code choice board. So if I click on this, it is already available and it prompts you what you need to put into that space. But it's not just about us creating, it's about having the students create. So just scroll through and find some ideas, or look at some of the choices they have. If you're teaching math or languages, or maybe you're looking for a cross-curricular project, the idea is that we can give these opportunities, whether it's a method, if it's a digital tool, for example, like Muncie or Nearpod, or any of the other ones, some of which I didn't even get a chance to mention. Nearpod is another good one as well. I did mention that in the other session that I had done. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. But you can always find examples, things to get started with. So like I said, I have my students do business cards, and there were templates available, and I just worked through and had them change things on their own, and I kind of talked them through it. But for us as teachers, maybe we want to look at some of the choices that are there, and you can just change it really quickly. So if you're teaching students about writing and they're doing an essay, and here's an essay checklist, for example, history projects. So sometimes it's just one page, sometimes it's multiple pages. So looking at elements of fables, if I were to choose this one, you can get a preview and everything is set up for you. You can always go in and change some of the background, some of the characters, add more, add your Bitmoji in, change the text. But the idea is that it's already set up for you. and you don't have to start from scratch. However, with that being said, you can totally start from scratch. So I think it's really important that you find ideas that will work best for you, for your students, that promote a lot of choice in learning. And like I said, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, it's rdene915 on Twitter and on Instagram. And you can also feel free to contact me by email. And here is my contact information. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a message, send me a DM on Twitter. Check out my podcast. I actually just share my own ideas. It's just me talking about things that I've done or sharing some different tools. So for learning anywhere, it's not just about one tool. There are lots of options out there. It's finding the one that's going to work best for you, for your students, trying it out, and asking them what they thought and seeing how it went and reflecting on it. And if it went really well, then great. And if it didn't go so well, that's okay, because there's plenty of other options out there. Or ask your students, like, what could we do better? What could I, as a teacher, do better? So again, thank you for joining in. Would love to connect with you. If you have questions, let me know. If you have tried some of these, or if there are some tools that you would like to share with me, please let me know. I would love to hear from you. And I hope that you enjoy the whole summit and look forward to connecting with you all. And thanks for joining in today.